I can't tell if I'm live yet. Should I just get started or not?
No worries. I think we're not live yet.
Okay. Just tell me when I should start.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another session for Primate Conversations. For those of you that are tuning in for the first time, this is an online seminar series run by the Primate Models for Behavioural Evolution Lab. Sorry, I've got a bit of lag here. So with this seminar series has been running for around 4 years now, and we tend to have a focus on primates, but it's really interdisciplinary with everything spanning from animal behaviour to archaeology, human evolution and genetics. So if you want to know more information about the seminar series, we posted the lab link and also the Twitter, so you can see that in the comments. And if you subscribe to the YouTube channel, you can see some of the previous talks we've had. And this time we've had a really amazing lineup of speakers, and we're very fortunate to have Amanda Tan speak to us today on the origins of tool use in the MACAQUE model system. So just to give an introduction, Amanda is a psychologist, evolutionary anthropologist and field researcher at the Department of Anthropology in Durham. As many of you will know, that the research in our lab works on sort of modelling the evolutionary origins of humans through the lens of primate behaviour. So we're all particularly interested in how tool use has evolved and merged in humans and different species. So several of us in the lab have been following Amanda's work with a lot of interest, as her research has played sort of a key role in studying one of only 3 primate taxa that use stone tools in the wild. So that's the long-tailed macaques in Myanmar and Thailand, where she's been conducting field research since 2012. So she's made some key discoveries over recent years, and including looking at the fine-grained variation in action patterns for food processing and percussive stone tool use of shellfish by macaques, but also the ontogeny and the potential social learning biases of this behaviour. So this work has already had a sort of big impact in the field, but also the wider public as well. Some of you may have already had a little insight into her research, having featured on the BBC documentaries Primates, which featured last year. So I'd like to extend a warm virtual welcome on behalf of our lab and everyone watching. And if anyone has any questions or comments, please add them to the live feed throughout the talk, and hopefully we can address them at the end. So thank you again, Amanda. And yeah, without further ado, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Dan, for the really nice introduction. Hi, everyone. I can't see anyone, so I have no idea if you're there or not. But I'm just going to assume that some people are listening. And thank you all for coming today. And thank you to the lab for inviting me to share some of our research with you. So today I'll just be sharing some of the ongoing work and past work also that's been done on these very amazing macaques that use stone tools. So a bit of background about how I came into this research. As Dan mentioned, I was in the psychology department as a PhD student. And so I first started studying macaque tool use from that lens of looking at skill development and social learning. And I came into anthropology really kind of fairly recently, actually, as a postdoc, because as it turns out, these macaques might be able to make some very unique contributions to some very long-standing questions in paleoanthropology and evolutionary anthropology. So today I'm just going to share some of the work that my collaborators and I are doing to try and crack away, taking advantage of this very convenient pun at understanding the origins of stone tool use in macaques. And hopefully this could provide some comparative perspective for examining the significance of tool use in our own evolutionary past. Okay, so first and foremost, why is stone tool use such a big topic in human origin studies? So first, it's actually the most well-preserved record of early human technology because stone tool use kind of persists in the archaeological record. Okay, many researchers have pointed to how technological change, particularly in the evolution of stone tool use and lithic culture, has been closely linked to many of our other biological and cultural evolutionary processes. Okay, some also say that stone tool use allowed early humans to cross a certain adaptive threshold. And so there's been research to show that the advent of stone tool use was linked with things like an increase in brain size, also associated possibly with other cognitive characteristics that are unique to humans, such as language capabilities. We also see a lot of change in the form of stone tools throughout the archaeological record. And so some say this might be linked to cultural abilities. Stone tool use has also been linked to the ability to acquire food resources and to other things like cooperative hunting, which of course has implications for the evolution of our social cognition. And also the ability to exploit coastal resources, perhaps with stone tools, has also been linked to things like human dispersal. Okay, so these questions are still ongoing, and there's still a lot of discussion going on about what were the early kind of factors that were needed in order for stone tool use to arise and to then continue to evolve. There's also a lot of talk about mechanisms of coevolution. So whether stone tool use allowed for language to evolve, or whether language allowed stone tool use to evolve further, or if it's a kind of feedback loop going on. So these kinds of questions are still persistent. There's also questions about the adaptive significance of tool use. So what benefits did tool use afford the early users? And also there's an ongoing culture war. So whether tool use was cultural and whether technological advancement was more due to cultural processes, or could there even be kind of a genetic basis underlying early tool use? And so as your lab knows very well, when we're talking about examining questions about behavioral evolution of humans, we often look to primates as models for understanding the origins and evolution of human behavior. And so tool use in primates is actually quite rare, and particularly stone tool use has only been documented today in 3 primate species in the wild. So we know, of course, about the chimpanzees, and then we have the capuchins in Brazil, and the long-tailed macaques in Asia, in parts of Thailand and Myanmar. Okay, so all primates use unmodified percussive stone tools, unlike humans, which use lots of modified stone tools. And so it's thought that we can use primates to understand the really early origins of early forms of tool use in human evolution. Okay, and as you can see, these different primate species occupy very different ecological settings, and they also have very different social structures and different levels of social cognition, perhaps. And so they do provide interesting comparative models for testing the various hypotheses regarding the origins and maintenance of the earliest forms of lithic technology. So the macaque model system is the most recent one to come under study. And macaques actually have been using tools for a very long time. And the first record of it being published was actually in 1887, back in Nature. So a long time ago, someone has already snagged the Nature publication, and we haven't got one since then on macaque stone tool use. But the early reports was just actually made by a sailor who was sailing through Myanmar, and he saw some monkeys using stones on the beach. And from his first observation, he says that I generally found that they had selected a stone apparently more for convenience in handling than for its value as a hammer. And so he thought that macaques just chose whatever tools they could pick up to use as a tool. So, but as we'll see that once we've studied their behavior more closely, we know that this is not true, and they do select the appropriate tools for the job. And some other unique features about the macaques that make them such an interesting model system for studying tool use. So studies, like I said, like I mentioned, began only in 2007, so still fairly recent, and a lot of things we still don't know about them. But what's really interesting is that tool use is very rare given the species distribution of the long-tailed macaque. So MACAQUE fascicularis is the common long-tailed macaque. So you can see that the gray areas represent the species distribution, and they're distributed all over Southeast Asia. And so macaques are notorious for being kind of like temple monkeys. They're not so much known for their tool use abilities, although here in this one temple in Lopburi in Thailand, they use a different form of tool. So here, this monkey you can see is using human hair as teeth floss to clean its teeth. So they do have instances of tool use, but by and large, they're not so much known for their tool using abilities, but rather they're kind of known for being jerks to tourists, snatching their belongings, taking food from them. And in a lot of places in Thailand where there are monkeys living on islands, the monkeys don't use tools, but instead they are used as tourist attractions on these monkey islands where tourists come and feed the macaques. However, in this very small region in their geographic distribution, which encompasses part of Myanmar and then parts of southern Thailand, we can find this behavior of macaques using stone tools. Again, some other features that make this model system unique when compared to the other two primate species that we know use stone tools. So firstly, the macaques are using stone tools in coastal habitats. Again, coastal habitats in itself is quite an important topic in human evolution research. So I think a couple of weeks ago, you did also have one speaker talking about the importance of coastal resources for early hominins. So this is one area where we'll see later how the macaques might be able to contribute some insight as to the early evolutionary advantages of being along the coast. Again, importantly, within these habitats, the macaques are using tools on a wide range of animal prey species, which are very rich in protein. And again, we'll come to this later in the talk, but this gives us some unique ways of looking at the advantages of stone tool use. And lastly, compared to other primate species, there seems to be a lot more kind of individual level variation in tool use and associated behaviors in the population. So people who study capuchins and chimpanzees, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but in macaque populations, not all adult individuals will acquire the ability to use tools. So across the populations that we've looked at, between about 60 to 80% of individuals within a group, of adult individuals within a group have the ability to use tools, while the rest of them never really acquire the ability. And I think from the literature, from reading it and from talking to some people, it seems that in a capuchin or chimpanzee group that has the ability to use tools, all adult individuals will be able to use tools. Okay, and as we'll see also, there are very many different individual styles that the macaques within the groups might use to use tools. And this gives us some clue that there might be differences in the learning processes across the species and the way they acquire tool use skills. Okay, so since the macaques are quite a new model system for studying tool use, perhaps maybe some of you haven't seen for yourself how it looks like. So I'll just play this short video that I've stolen from a BBC documentary that was made on the macaques in the island, which is the hunt, just to give you an idea of what the macaques are doing when we say that they're using stone tools on shellfish.
As the tide begins to fall, the macaques make their way down to the shore. A beachside restaurant is about to open. There's plenty of food here if you know how to get at it. The macaques have learnt to use heavy rocks as tools to break open the sea snails. It takes a great deal of skill to master this technique. As the tide falls still further, it reveals the next course. To feed on this dish, they need a stone tool with a very particular shape. They're after rock oysters. To crack the shells open, they must strike the oyster in just the right place with their chosen tool. You have to be ingenious to make a living at the coast.
So hopefully that gave all of you a better visual of what I'm about to talk about. And so this diagram just shows the kind of big research project that's ongoing. And I'm only just a small part of this research project. As you can see, we have many collaborators working together, and each of us are looking at decoding macaque stone tool use from various different perspectives and bringing in also a lot of different skills and expertise for methods of looking at these questions. Okay, so in order to kind of really understand why a behavior emerges and evolves, we kind of need to do three main things. And so we first need to document the behavior and describe in detail the prevalence of the behavior, any variation in behavior, what the animals are actually doing, and also any predispositions or associated traits we might be able to identify with the behavior, and also to describe the learning processes that we think might be going on. Okay, and then we also need to elucidate kind of underlying proximate mechanisms that might give rise to the variation that we see. So we can look at whether there are genetic basis for the behavior, whether ecological factors are shaping the behavior, and also whether there are any cultural mechanisms underlying the behavior. Again, lastly, to kind of really think about how a behavior might have evolved, it's very important to quantify the adaptive significance of the behavior. So what actual fitness benefits did the behavior afford to the animals? And this is actually the most difficult part of any study, because in order to really quantify fitness and reproductive benefits, you do require kind of long-term studies on reproductive success. But we can also kind of look at other more short-term benefits of the behavior in the meantime. And so for the rest of the talk, I'll just be touching on some studies that I've been more personally involved in within this larger project. I'm touching on the various different areas that we've studied macaque stone tool use. Okay, so when I first joined the research project as a PhD student, fairly little was known about macaque stone tool use. It's only been studied at one population so far by my supervisor and some of his early collaborators. And so what was published and what was known back then was what you saw in the video. So we knew that macaques were selecting stone tools. They were using basically two main types of tool use techniques. So they were using what we call pound hammering, using the face of larger tools to crack open unattached food items such as sea snails or clams that they would put on a rock surface or an anvil surface and crack open like this. But they would also use another technique called axe hammering when they were processing oysters that grew on rocks. So in this case, they would choose a rather smaller tool and use the sharp points of the tools to crack open the oysters, because they couldn't move the oysters to place them on any anvils. And this was a more precise way to crack open a fixed point on the rock. Okay, so when I first then went to see the macaques for myself, I realized that they were doing a lot more than just these two techniques. So the macaques seem to have a lot of their own ways of doing things. So when I first looked across the beach, there were some monkeys like this one using her whole body, jumping up and down, trying to pound the oysters. Some of them were just seated. Some of them used two hands. Some of them used one hand. And some of them also used rather kind of strange actions, which I'll show you an example of later. So this was my first project as a PhD student, was to look at the detailed technical variation or detailed action patterns that macaques might use within the population to carry out stone tool use. And so I was given by my supervisor, Dr. Michael Gumet, lots of videos taken from a boat, because these macaques were not habituated. So it was videos that were going up and down in the sea. I'm getting really seasick watching these videos. But in the end, we managed to identify that within this population, there were 17 different action patterns that the macaques were using. So some of them were quite common action patterns, as you would expect, maybe the most kind of efficient or functional ways of cracking open shellfish. And they look like this, so using two hands and the face, or one hand and the point. But we also saw a lot of kind of more idiosyncratic patterns. And one of this is this monkey here. As you can see, she's using a underhand striking motion, which is quite unusual and idiosyncratic only to her. And so we call this action pattern jabbing. This is just one example of a more unusual action pattern. And also what's interesting about her is that when I first saw her in the videos that I was watching, she was a juvenile about this size using that action pattern. And 4 years later, at the end of my PhD, when she was kind of grown up, she was still using this action pattern. Okay, so this is the variation that we know of in just one population of macaques. And so this current research was done here at this lower star on Pyaknyamyai Island. And when I started doing my PhD, we came across another island up here, Koram Island, where the macaques were also using tools. But comparing these two populations, we already see some quite striking differences in the action patterns that they use. Okay, so while we talked about the macaques on Pyaknyamyai, the first island, having these two distinct techniques for different types of food, we see that in Koram Island, the macaques actually used a lot of the tool's edges, which the monkeys on Pyaknyamyai Island didn't really use. And they used these edges to crack open both unattached food items as well as rock oysters. And it's quite puzzling, because it seems like the edge would be neither the most effective surface for each task. Okay, another thing we noticed was also that the monkeys here out of the whole population, only this one individual would use 2 hands to crack open, to handle stones. Otherwise, all the other monkeys always only used 1 hand to crack open stones. And as you can see, it wasn't really because there was a lack of big stones on this island or a lack of big food items on this island. So it seems that there might be some variation in the action patterns that monkeys were using across the island. We also know now, although I don't have any data to show here about the action patterns, is that Lydia Lungs, one of our collaborators, has also started studying a 3rd population of macaques. And over there, they are also cracking open oil palm nuts in the forest interiors. So far, we haven't found any evidence that these populations of monkeys that we've studied have used stone tools in forest interiors. And also most recently, when I was filming just before lockdown started at the beginning of this year with a French film crew, that film crew had actually gone to a different island, a military island where they were filming something else. And they saw macaques there pick up tools, pick up big stones to use as tools. But instead of holding the stone and pounding open the oysters or cracking open the oysters, they would throw the stone against a rock and then go over to the rock to see what they had managed to crack open. And they'll pick up the stone and throw it again at another rock. So we can already see that across different populations, there are different action patterns. I haven't been able to see that population for myself, but I think as soon as lockdown ends, I would really like to see that for myself. Okay, so for my own dissertation, I started to get really interested in looking at skill development and looking at how macaques would acquire their tool use skills and perhaps get a clue as to how they might come up with all these different variants. Okay, but I mean, in truth, I just wanted an excuse to follow baby monkeys around on the beach. But anyway, over my PhD, when I was living in Thailand with the macaques for almost 2 years, I looked across age groups at how they developed their tool using skills. So I first looked at what kind of objects they manipulated and what sequence their object manipulation turned up as. So as you can see from the graph on the left here, the monkeys would first start manipulating just single objects, either just a stone or just a shellfish. And they started really young. So you can see this monkey here still has its black kind of natal coat. It's less than kind of 6 months old. And so they already are attracted to these objects. And what was also interesting to me was that these infants were attracted not to the food items first, but to the stones first. Okay, so they seem to have some kind of innate attraction to stones. And I think this is quite interesting, particularly when we think about stone handling behavior that are present in other macaque species that don't use stones as tools. It seems that maybe some macaques have an unexplained kind of predisposition to be attracted to manipulating stones. And this could have been one of the early factors contributing to the emergence of tool use. Okay, and then looking at when they started to acquire the right skills, we see that they only started to predominantly manipulate stones and food items together when they reach about 2.5 years of age. And then looking across at changes in manipulation complexity. So these categories are just things like whether they manipulated a single object with a single action or a single object with multiple actions. Oops, sorry. Going all the way up to whether they manipulated all the right objects, but in the wrong combination, and then in the correct combinations for using tools on oysters and using tools on unattached food items. Okay, this kind of was adapted from one of the development studies on chimpanzees by chimpanzee tool use by Inui Nakamura and colleagues. Okay, so here we find that at the age of 1.5 to 2.5 years, in that age group, the monkeys started to manipulate stones and shells together, and also they did it in kind of the wrong combination for tool use to be successful. And it was only when they reached 2.5 to 3.5 years old that they managed to crack open unattached shellfish and oysters, because they had figured out the right combinations of actions or right sequence of actions. So they would correctly put the food item on the anvil and then take the stone and crack the food item, versus something like putting the stone on the anvil and trying to put the food item on top of the stone. So they had the wrong combinations for a while. And so they did undergo a long period of kind of individual trial and learning in order to develop their tool use skills. Okay, and another thing that was interesting was that 2.5 to 3.5 years old seemed to be kind of a critical period for learning. So it was like all of a sudden, once they were able to do it successfully, those who were able to would just continue consistently doing it successfully and improving in things like strike accuracy and other measures of proficiency. However, a proportion of individuals who didn't manage to acquire tool use by this age group seemed to then remain non-tool users for the rest of their lives. So they would consume shellfish mostly by scrounging, okay, or trying to bite them open, which might be a less efficient way or in other ways damaging to the teeth. Okay, so a student was also interested in the social learning interaction, so looking for clues as to whether macaques were in some ways learning from each other and what possible social learning mechanisms could be going on. And so what I found was that when I compared infants with juveniles with adults, the infants and juveniles carried out on average more interactions with tool users. So they would be close to tool users, taking food from them, observing them, and also being interested in the stones and the tools that they were using. Okay, again, more interestingly, when you break down the types of interactions they were engaging in with tool users, we find that infants and juveniles would be also, so across all age groups, individuals would scrounge a lot from tool users, so they would get the products of tool use from the tool users. But if you look across at the other types of interactions, infants and juveniles also observe tool users, so they would sit close to tool users and stare at the hands and of the tool users to see what they were doing. And they will also engage in other types of interactions, for example, reaching out to touch the tool user's arms or trying to touch the stone as it was being used. Whereas in adults, their interactions with tool users were related only to getting food from them. So it seems like, again, relating back to the period of learning, once they're past the learning age, it seems that interactions that might facilitate learning also fall off. So they could also then lose the motivation to learn. Okay, and then I wanted to look at whether there were any social learning biases in these interactions to possibly try and figure out who was learning from who, or whether this might contribute to some of the patterns of behavioral variation that we see across the group. And so what I found was, as you expect in a hierarchical society like the one that macaques live in, most of the interactions, so I looked across at the proportion of interactions each individual had with another tool user. And by and large, the largest proportion of this was interactions towards close associates. So we couldn't know kin relationships for sure in all cases. So I used a grooming-based association index to infer the relationships. And it seems like they would then associate or interact with most of tool users that they were most closely associated with. However, after controlling for social relationships, I also found that learners were more likely to interact with the older tool users and also with tool users that carried out a higher rate of tool use, so they had cracked more food items opened in a minute or in a certain time period, and also with better strike efficiency, so tool users that used fewer strikes to crack open a food item. So there is some evidence here that the macaques are kind of interacting more with the better tool users in the group as one means of social learning. Again, then also for the last part of my dissertation, I went to investigate how social relationships might be seen in patterns of inter-individual behavioral similarity. Okay, so I paired up every monkey in the group. So I put them in diets and calculated their association index based on the amount of time they spent grooming each other. And then I classified them as to whether they were similar or dissimilar on various measures of their tool use characteristics. Okay, so for example here, if they were a similar diet in being a tool user, then both individuals in the diet would be a tool user. If they were dissimilar, then one individual in the diet was a tool user and one was not. Okay, then in terms of things like frequency of tool use or preference for a certain tool use pattern, whether it's face hammering, edge hammering, or food preference, I divided similar diets into whether both individuals were in kind of the upper quartile of the group in using face hammering out of their total proportions of tool use. Okay, so both were often face hammerers, or if they were dissimilar, then one often used face hammering and one didn't. Okay, so interestingly here, you can see that by and large, those diets that were closer in those diets that were similar also had higher association indices. So they tend to have closer social relationships. But one effect that was significant was in the proportion of edge hammering that these macaques carried out. And so if you think back to looking at the intergroup differences, this group in particular carried out edge hammering a lot more than the other population that we first studied. And it seems like this might be related to the social relationships of the monkeys in this population in some way, which is kind of interesting when thinking about things like social learning and cultural transmission. Oh, before I move on, one thing that I want to raise a question or to ask is that the mechanisms for why monkeys might come to derive edge hammering as their kind of most prominent tool use pattern is kind of puzzling to me, because it would seem that it's not the most efficient kind of action pattern for cracking either sessile oysters or unattached food items. And also there is a large proportion of trial and error learning with the macaques. So I don't really see a clear link between why similar diets would come up with edge hammering, or closely related diets would be similar in edge hammering. But one thought in the literature that I was reading was that related individuals might perceive and respond to feedback from trial and error learning in more similar ways. And so they're more likely to arrive at kind of similar solutions than non-related individuals. And this might hint at some kind of biological or genetic basis for tool use, which is the next thing that I would come to discuss. Okay, so we were starting to think about whether there was a genetic basis for tool use, first by looking at morphology as a proxy for genetic similarity. And I'll explain why we can do this in the macaque model system. Okay, so traditionally, studies on primate tool use and culture have often tried to kind of write off genetic influences as an explanation for the emergence of technological behavior. Okay, but realistically, we should know that all behavior is a result of an interplay between biological inheritance and learning processes and environmental influences. And so genetic inheritance is a kind of an important evolutionary process that we shouldn't ignore, but should study if we have the chance. Okay, but also most of the time, this is very difficult to study because most members of a population would be genetically similar. However, looking at the long-tail macaques and the distribution of their tool use behavior gives us some very unique opportunities to try and identify links between genetics and tool use. So this is some work that I carried out in collaboration with my PhD supervisor, Michael Gumet, and some of our other collaborators in Thailand as well. So let's look first at this left-hand side graph. And you can see that where the red dots are, these are places where macaque populations have been found and have been found to use stone tools. So there's been evidence that they use stone tools. Whereas in the green, these are where macaque populations occupy coastal environments as well, but there's no evidence here that they use stone tools. Okay, moving on to the graph on the right-hand side, the dotted lines are not clear, but I'll just highlight to you the different subspecies zones. So you can see here in red, this is the subspecies zone of the Burmese long-tail macaque subspecies, so Macaque fascicularis aurea. Okay, and in the blue, this is the subspecies zone of the common subspecies of macaque, of long-tail macaque, so Macaque fascicularis fascicularis. You can see roughly here that it's the Burmese long-tail macaques that are using stone tools, while it's the common subspecies that are not using stone tools. Okay, so there might be some kind of subspecies difference. And opportunistically, the population that I was studying at in Koram Island in the Gulf of Thailand, the macaques here are actually hybrid. So they are in the hybrid zone between the two subspecies. And so this gives us kind of a natural laboratory for kind of teasing apart maybe a subspecies linked to tool use. Okay, and so from the work of very kind of early taxonomists, so from Jack Fuden's work, he found that the subspecies could be distinguished by certain morphological features, particularly the patterns of their facial hair. So we can see here on the Burmese subspecies, we have what we call an infrazygomatic cheek hair pattern. So the zygomatic arch is kind of where our cheekbone is, and the hair grows parallel to the cheekbone. And also the hair around the ear, so the periauricular hair, is directed backwards towards the ear. Okay, whereas when we look at the common long-tailed macaque species, we see that instead of an infrazygomatic cheek hair pattern, they have a transzygomatic one. So it's kind of perpendicular and cutting through the cheekbone. And also the hair around their ears grows forward instead of pointing back towards the ears. Okay, when we look at the macaques in our population on Coram Island, we can see that there are two different kind of morphologies. So we can see that some macaques show a mix of the Burmese long-tailed macaque hair patterns and the common long-tailed macaque hair patterns. So they have a infrazygomatic cheek hair, but maybe forward-pointing ear hair. And then we also see some individuals that have the common long-tailed macaque pattern. Okay, so based on the morphological differences, we might infer that these ones with the hybridized cheek hair patterns might have more kind of genetic material of the Burmese subspecies. So it's not, I guess genetics are more complicated than that. So it's not as simple, but we decided to use their facial hair morphology as a preliminary kind of analysis for whether there might be any differences between the subspecies in their tool use abilities. And so here are the results. So this is the purely Burmese population, which is the first population we started studying at on Piak Nham Yai Island. And there is a much higher prevalence of adult tool users here in this purely Burmese population than in the hybrid population on Coram Island. Again, within the Coram Island population, very interestingly, those with the common cheek hair pattern, so those of the common subspecies of macaques that are not known to use tools, there was a significantly lower proportion of tool use amongst this morphology of macaques. So it does give us some preliminary evidence that there might be a subspecies link with tool use, and this is something that we're working on to try and do proper genetic analysis on. Okay, so however, once macaques started to use tools, so we looked at within just individuals who could use tools, so discounting all those who didn't use tools, there was no difference between the two phenotypes in whether how often they use tools and whether how proficient they were in using tools. Okay, so it seems like maybe the subspecies differences could link to something about the learning or the predisposition to acquire tool use rather than tool use skills itself. Okay, so now, yeah, like I mentioned, we're planning to try and do a bit more of proper genetics work, but that will require kind of catching the monkeys and trapping them and taking blood samples. So logistically, it's a bit more challenging, and particularly with the current COVID situation that's going on. So we're not really sure when we might be able to do that research. Okay, and another thing that I'll be really interested in looking at once we have got the proper genetic evidence is exactly what is the difference between the subspecies, or what is it about the genetic differences that is affecting differences in tool use abilities. So looking at whether genetic differences are linked to predispositional differences in manipulating objects or differences in cognitive abilities, for example. Okay, and then moving on to kind of the last bit of the research program that I've been involved in, looking at trying to quantify in some way the adaptive significance of tool use, I'll talk about an ongoing project that I started during my postdoc about looking at the nutritional benefits in terms of the ability to acquire proteins that macaques might get from tool use. Okay, so a background to this study, or why we came up with this study, was that for a long time, archaeologists have used the complexity of stone tool artifacts in the archaeological record as proxies for cognitive advancement in hominin evolution. Okay, but we know that brain size and cognition is very energetically costly. So this leads to the assumption that the nutritional benefits of early forms of tool use must have outweighed the cost of having greater cognitive capacities and larger brain sizes. Okay, and so one of the hypotheses as to how this might have taken place is that tool use might have increase the availability of higher quality diets. And so higher quality diets was kind of defined as a higher proportion of fat and protein and being lower in fiber and plant materials, okay? So leading to an increase in energy availability. Okay, however, this hypothesis itself has never been tested, particularly with primates. So, and part of that difficulty comes from because the previously known primate models of tool use, both primate species, both capuchins and chimpanzees, they use tools on plant materials, so making it kind of impossible to tease apart any kind of protein benefits of tool use over the other plant resources that they were feeding on. Okay, however, researchers that are studying tool use in crows, they have been able to do this using stable isotope analysis. So Christian Rutz and his team over at the University of St. Andrews, they examined this in a population of crows that use stick tools to acquire grubs within tree holes. Okay, so using stable isotope analysis by looking at the contributions of grubs versus other food items to the tissues of crows, they were able to figure out that that grubs, also tool use, contributed to about 30% of the protein and lipid intakes of crows. Okay, so tool use provided up to 30% of these high quality nutrients for crows. And so we thought that this might be a useful method to try out with the macaques because they conveniently used tools on a high protein resource. So we can exploit this kind of method for kind of quantifying the nutritional benefits of tool use in macaques. Yeah, in macaques, we were hoping that also because we know that not all of them use tools and we knew which individuals use tools and which individuals didn't, we were hoping that we would have the added advantage of being able to measure tool-mediated protein advantages at an individual level. So looking at comparing tool users versus non-tool users. Okay, so when we thought of this idea, I was kind of in the field. So me and my postdoc advisor, Nate Dominy at Dartmouth College in the US. So I only had time to get a preliminary sample of macaque hair from 2 juvenile individuals who don't use tools. And so this was the preliminary analysis that we had. So I collected these 2 hair samples and collected a bunch of their food samples. And so by analyzing the proportions of carbon and nutrients in all these different tissue samples, you can put them in stable isotope mixing models that will estimate the amount of protein that each food resource contributes to the tissue of these animals. Okay, so just taking some data from the literature on long-tail macaques in Singapore that never use tools, the preliminary results look quite promising because we can see that these juveniles, although they were not tool users, they had access to coastal resources from scrounging, and you can see that they had a higher proportion of coastal resources or protein than non-tool using macaques. Okay, using the model, we estimate that shellfish from scrounging contributed between 21 to 20% of the tissues of juvenile macaques. And so we thought that what more would adult tool users be able to get from their tool using abilities? And so we went on to conduct this study proper. And so what we needed to do in order to conduct stable isotope analysis was to collect samples of the macaque body tissue. So we collected tissue samples of their hair. And the macaques that I study are actually quite habituated. So if you wanted, you could go up to them and pluck their hair. But obviously for ethical reasons, and you wouldn't, because I never want to ask a student to do that, or because it wouldn't be also useful for habituated populations, we devised kind of a little method that we could remotely collect macaque hair from and film it on video. And so this was a little prototype of the method that we used to collect hair from the macaques. So we basically just put a clear glass bottle, a plastic bottle with some food below, and line the bottle with sticky tape, and the macaques would put their arms in to get the food, and then the sticky tape would catch some of the hair from their arms. Okay, so this actually worked best on the male macaques because they had more muscular forearms which pressed against the tape more. So there might be some refinement here we can do in order to collect better hair samples. And another advantage of this method of collection is that because macaques are kind of so like jerks to each other, once an individual gets to the food item, it would just deplete all the food. And so no other monkey would put their arm in. And so we can get samples from individuals. And of course, using videos and knowing the individuals in the population, you can be able to record which individual gave you that hair sample. Okay, then together with the hair samples, we also collected samples of all the different types of food that the macaques were eating. So the plant foods in their forests, the fruits that tourists sometimes came and gave to them, and the various different shellfish that they were eating. Okay, so after getting all the hair samples, it took us a long time to get the hair samples exported from Thailand to the US to be analyzed. And then there were other setbacks like the lab using a broken machine to try and analyze some of our hair samples. And so losing hair samples from kind of a lot of the most prominent tool users in our group. And so unfortunately, after analyzing the data that we got back, it hasn't quite panned out as we hoped. So you can see here that we weren't quite able to see a distinct advantage of being a tool user versus being a non-tool user in terms of the amount of protein that you could get from your abilities. Okay, and so I haven't fully processed the results yet, but we might have to start thinking of different explanations. So it could be perhaps that in this population, tool use doesn't really provide a significant advantage in terms of gaining protein. And this could maybe be because of the high levels of scrounging that macaques are able to engage in. But this could also be interested when thinking about the early advantages of tool use, even in humans. So it might show us that it didn't need to take the whole population of humans to be able to use tools in order to get some advantages, because they may have been able to share food or steal food from each other. So this gives us some clues as to the very early kind of early kind of significance of tool use maybe. Or there could be kind of other alternative explanations of which I haven't fully thought through, but I'm welcome to really take suggestions from people if anyone can think of why we might not notice any advantage of tool use. Okay, so just to recap, this is what we've done so far. And as you can see, we've kind of barely made a dent in all the research questions that we're trying to identify. And so there's still a lot of work and discussion going on with collaborators as to what else we can look at in terms of quantifying adaptive significance of tool use. So perhaps maybe the overall nutritional stress or social stress. It could be an advantage that if your population was able to use tools, there would be less food competition maybe. Also looking at perhaps the dental preservation benefits of being able to use tools, particularly when trying to crack open or trying to consume very sandy or very hard or gritty foods. Okay, so just some of the ongoing questions that we're trying to look at. And hopefully with more long-term study, we'll be able to look at measures like reproductive success, and looking at whether being able to use tools also has any effect on male rank and paternity. Okay, so just to end off the presentation, to acknowledge all the various collaborators that I've worked with and are still working with in order to produce more research and more of this kind of interesting research. And so I'd like to thank our collaborators, my PhD advisor and my collaborator in Thailand, many people that we first started working with out of the Primate Archaeology project, which is now no longer ongoing, but its members have spread out all over the place. So some are now in Susanna's lab here. Lydia Lungs, I believe, who I still work with, has gone over to the Max Planck Institute and set up her own research program there. And we continue to work together. So also thanking my postdoc advisors and collaborators, as well as the local community of Thailand for feeding me, for helping me move lots of logistics, and for also rescuing me when by, for example, cutting down the door of my house when I left my keys on the island and lost them to the sea. So also research wouldn't have been possible with the various funding support that I've received. Okay, so I'll come to the end of the presentation now. And as you can see, there are lots of questions still open, and I'm also happy to take questions or to discuss things with people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for that brilliant talk. I think it's, as a research student working with a single group of a primate species, it's really impressive seeing just the scope and the different research sort of tasks that you're doing in genetics and behavior. And ecology. So yeah, thank you for the brilliant talk. We do have a lot of questions, so I'm going to do my best to try and tie them together and filter through them, and also give you a bit of a breather in between them. But I might just get one of my questions in first. So this, I think, for my research when I started my PhD, I think I was seeing the amazing behavioural variation which you've documented for the sort of percussive stone tool use, and sort of seeing that variation, you do wonder how much sort of cultural evolutionary processes are going on. So there must be some sort of selection on that behavioural over time. So do you have sort of, now that the project's moving along, do you have long-term data, and are you intending on looking at how that behavioural variation is sort of occurring over sort of a longitudinal perspective?
So we haven't, again, kind of conducted a recensus, so to say, of like the proportion of individuals that are using each action pattern. But it seems that there will always be the more common action patterns, which may be the most effective ones. We also haven't explicitly tested the effectiveness of each action pattern, so it's quite hard to say at this point whether there is kind of any cultural selection for the most effective patterns, or the opposite might be true, that cultural processes may be allowing for the prevalence of for the persistence, I mean, of not so effective kind of action patterns, which is an interesting thing to think about in terms of culture. We always think of it as something adaptive, but it might also have maybe some maladaptive effects. Yeah, so it's still a question for the future. So
lots to explore along those lines. So yeah, we have loads of questions here. We have some on stone tools and archaeology, some on development, some on the sort of comparative models. So we might just start with a general overview. So we've got a question here. So what do you think is distinctive about stone tool use in macaques when you compare it to other species like capuchins and chimpanzees? And do you think that they're sort of a better model for the origins of tool use, and why? So I haven't been able to, for personally myself, to see capuchins and chimpanzees use tools. So what I know is from the literature, or from talking to other researchers and collaborators. And so there are a couple of interesting differences, apart from the ones that I've already mentioned in the talk about them occupying different kinds of coastal ecologies and using tools on animal prey. There are also other differences that I see in that with macaques that use stone tools, it seems like that's the only form of tool use that these populations have used. And they only use stone tools in this percussive way for cracking open shellfish and nuts. Whereas I feel like in the chimpanzees and the capuchin populations, those populations that use stone tools also use a variety of other tools. So they may also use stick tools, or they might use stone tools for many different things. And so I do not know if the tool use behavior in macaque is a bit more constrained or a bit less flexible. And so they might, it's hard to say what's a better model system for examining different questions. So each has its own advantages. So yeah, macaques might be useful for questions about coastal significance, for example. But I think it's not one single model system that's the most effective for answering questions, but rather when you compare across model systems and look at the differences and similarities, then you might be able to come up with explanations for why these differences exist. So yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that stone tool use is the only tool use documented for that population. We had one question asking, why the focus on stone tools in that population, but I suppose that sort of answers the question in some capacity. We've got another question here. How much to do with sort of the presence of tool use in the population? So how much of this absence of tool use in some population is due to potential absence, sort of in the way that the data is being collected through systematic surveys, versus tool use being, actually absent? Could it be that there's some tool use that we're just not seeing because it's subtle or undocumented as of yet?
So the map with the red dots and the green dots about like all the populations where evidence for tool use has been found and tool use has not been found. That's actually work done by my PhD supervisor, Michael Gumet. And so he did go to each island and survey the islands. And what you realize is that it's actually quite obvious if there's tool use going on in a macaque population, because there's quite a big numbers of them. And when you go out and walk along the beach, you'll see the traces of tool use kind of everywhere. So you see a stone next to a cracked open food item, even if you never see the macaques yourself. So I would think that it would be quite observable. And we also relied on reports from local people to confirm or to see whether we need to look at a place again. Because sometimes the local people might tell us that they do use tools, but they're not really clear as to what we mean by tool use. So we would go back and confirm with them and check with them and go out to see the macaques ourselves.
So we have another question related to actually human presence. And you mentioned sort of, people observing, locals observing behaviours.
Yeah.
And the implications for that for sort of human evolution. So what could be the role of the human presence in these coastal ecosystems influencing whether or not tool use happens in those areas? Yeah.
So there could be very drastic effects and more subtle effects. So as we know, like humans are always changing the environment. So there are places where perhaps the humans have already depleted the resources or they have settled the coast. And so these coastal kind of habitats where tool use might be carried out may not persist. And so there's no habitat for macaques to use tools and they don't use tools. There could also be other ways, for example, the population that's habituated, so the second population that I talked about, tourists do come and they do feed the macaques. And so this might be disruptive to the social learning processes because as the monkeys are using tools, if they see a tourist boat coming, they stop what they're doing and they run over and they get the fruit. And so that it could be one of the reasons also why we see a lower prevalence of tool use in this group versus the unhabituated group. Yeah, but in the unhabituated group, there are kind of instances of illegal farming and people bringing domestic dogs. And there's also some evidence that this is kind of negatively affecting the social learning processes of monkeys there.
Yeah, it's interesting you say, about sort of human influence and affecting the diet, because, I've done a little bit of work with Japanese monkeys and looking at long-term data, human provisioning does have a significant impact on behavior, but it's also a potential for sort of innovation as well in some ways.
Yeah.
I feel like some diversification of food processing, for example, can occur through new and novel types of food.
The humans have definitely introduced some new items that macaques can use tools on. So the humans sometimes leave like glass bottles with a bit of beer or like Red Bull or some kind of energy drink in there. And the monkeys love that. So they take a stone and they'll crack open the glass bottle and drink up the liquid in there.
So lots of innovation going on that could be studied potentially. Yeah. So if we've got, I think, a bit more time for some more questions, if you're not exhausted by the barrage. So we've got some more on the actual properties of the stone tools themselves, because we didn't really get a chance to look at them in detail. So we've got one question: can we see the shape of the rocks that are used as hammers by these monkeys? Are they all the same stone type? So is there potentially selection for tools based on size and shape and the actual geological properties? Because this would be interesting for looking at the hominin record and sites like MACAQUE. We've got another sort of follow-on from that is how heavy they are. This would be sort of useful from a sort of human evolution.
Yeah, so at the different study sites, there are different rock materials available. So there's a lot of kind of basalt stones available at the first study site. And on the second one, it's a bit more like limestone, sandstone. I'm not really a rock expert, so I'm still also trying to figure this out. There are definitely some materials that some monkeys seem to have a preference for. So Some monkeys seem to have a preference for quartz, which is a very hard material. In terms of the weights, so the tools that are used as stones are different from the random stones that are just on the beach. So oyster tools tend to be smaller than average, and the other tools tend to be larger than average. So the pound hammers tend to be larger than average. So there is some kind of evidence that they are selecting. From observation, and I don't have lots of data on this also, is that some individuals do seem to have a preference for shape. So they might always choose the same shape. But again, I haven't properly analyzed this. There is research ongoing. So I have collected a bunch of stones, and I'm working with Lydia Lunks and some primate archaeologists to properly analyze the shapes of the stones, the scarring patterns made on stones, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from doing a little bit of research with chimpanzees, we know at BOSU that there is the preference for specific tools even.
Yeah.
So do you think it's possible that some individuals actually have those preferences for the tools themselves, or
yeah, I think they definitely do.
Cache them away or reuse them?
I have no evidence that they do store them or cache them away, but there is, I think, a strong likelihood that some individuals are always selecting similar types of tools.
So just to, I've still got a massive list here, so we might do a couple more.
Yeah.
And then we can close the primate conversation session for today. So moving on to a little bit about development.
Mm-hmm.
We've got one question here about, in the sort of the graph you showed with the ontogeny, there's seemingly a sudden jump between 1 to 2 years and sort of 2.5 to 3.5 years. So any ideas of why you see that massive jump in development in that sort of short space of time?
Yeah, I do not know for sure. And also, so that was a cross-sectional study. So it wasn't a longitudinal study. Otherwise, I'd probably still be like doing my PhD to this day. But yeah, so I don't really know, but it could be things like changes in physical development, so physical strength. It could also be things like older individuals getting less tolerant of them as they get older, and so making this like push for them to do more stuff on their own. So there could be various explanations, but not explicitly tested yet, but all good areas for further research.
And just to do a sort of final question, so what might be the explanation for, we see, you mentioned with the behaviours that there's adult scrounging that goes on when there's sort of close proximity observations of the behaviour. So what are the explanations for that? Could it be primarily caused by adults that did not successfully use tools, or something else?
Yeah, so most of the scroungers would be individuals that are not able to use tools. And so in this case, if you're the higher ranking individuals, particularly who are not able to use tools, will be able to kind of chase away the lower ranking individuals that can use tools. I guess your next question will be if I see any like effect of rank on tool using ability. And no, there's actually no obvious effect. So we have both high ranking and low ranking tool users. So I'm not really sure that that's one of the factors influencing on whether they're able to learn how to use tools or not. Yeah, but those who don't use tools try their best to scrounge from other individuals.
Okay, so I think there are still plenty of questions, but I would encourage anyone who's seen the talk today to get in touch with Amanda if you have any follow-up questions at all.
Yeah, that's fine. You send me an email or something.
And thank you so much for joining us for this week's session.
Thanks for having me.
A really amazing talk with a huge scope. And next week, I'll just remind everyone that we are joined by Julie Lesnick on edible insects and human evolution on Tuesday, the 10th of November at 4 p.m. So a big thank you again to Amanda, and we hope to see some of you again then.